Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mr. Bean Family Story Channel. This is where every day we bring you interesting, fun, and inspiring stories from the Mr. Bean family. You'll meet me, Mr. Bean, someone you're probably already familiar with, and I hope you love my son with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely daughter, who always brings positive energy with stories that are close to life. Each day, one of us will share new stories, exciting journeys, and today is my turn. I'll take you on a fun adventure, but also with deep life lessons. Today's story carries a simple yet important message. Never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprising things waiting for us. If you enjoy the lively atmosphere of our family, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave your fun comments so I know what you think. Now let's dive into today's story and immerse ourselves in a world full of surprises. Let's go! The morning sun bathed the gleaming marble floors of Atlantic National Bank as Sarah Johnson walked through the massive glass doors. At 34, she exuded a quiet confidence that contradicted her casual attire. Gray sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt. Despite her unassuming look, she was a force in her own right. Sarah was the founder of the Johnson Educational Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting underprivileged children, and she had a presence that commanded respect, even in the understated simplicity of her clothing. Beside her walked Daniel Johnson, her husband. At 42, he had built his fortune from the ground up, creating a powerhouse technology company that revolutionized the industry. His tailored navy suit and platinum watch were the trademarks of his wealth, marking him as someone who was no stranger to power. Yet despite his success, Daniel had always chosen to live modestly, preferring a life of quiet dignity over the flamboyant displays of wealth that others often indulged in. As they approached the entrance of the bank, Daniel glanced at Sarah, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you sure you want to handle this alone?" he asked, checking his watch. Sarah smiled softly and squeezed his hand. "Absolutely. This is something I've always done on my own. It's part of our agreement, remember?" Their relationship had always been built on mutual respect. While Daniel's business empire had brought them unimaginable wealth, Sarah preferred to focus her energy on the foundation. It was her life's work, and she had always kept it separate from the complexities of their personal fortune. "You know I'm always here if you need me," Daniel added, his tone warm yet thoughtful. Sarah nodded, appreciating the offer, but she was determined to take care of this herself. As they entered the marble lobby of Atlantic National, the contrast between their appearances became immediately noticeable. Several bank employees straightened at the sight of Daniel's immaculate suit, while Sarah's comfortable outfit earned her confused glances. The air seemed to shift as people assessed them, one obviously belonging to the world of high finance, the other an outsider. Sarah felt the weight of the stares, but chose to ignore them. She had been in similar situations before, and this was no different. Their visit today was unusual. Rather than conducting business electronically as they usually did for the foundation, they needed to establish a new account for an upcoming initiative. It required in-person handling of the paperwork, something that seemed trivial, but in a world that valued appearance over substance, it became the focal point of everything. "Go ahead," Daniel said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the lobby. "I'll take that call from Singapore in the lobby." Sarah nodded and walked toward the customer service area, where the first interaction of what would become an unforgettable day awaited. She approached the desk of Rebecca Palmer, the bank's customer service manager. Sarah had no idea that Rebecca's judgment, clouded by her own biases, would soon shape the rest of the morning. Rebecca Palmer sat behind the polished desk, her perfectly styled blonde hair and crisp white blouse projecting an image of professionalism. However, the tension in her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes betrayed the fact that things were not going well for her today. She had spent years vying for a promotion, only to see it go to someone else from another branch. The disappointment lingered in her posture, though her smile remained intact. As Sarah approached the counter, Rebecca's gaze flicked over her outfit, sweatpants, a t-shirt, and sneakers. She immediately assessed Sarah as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a bank like Atlantic National. The foundation's recent large donation could not possibly be legitimate, at least not in Rebecca's eyes. Atlantic National was a bank for the elite, and she assumed Sarah's appearance didn't match the caliber of their clientele. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice calm and pleasant, despite the undercurrent of tension she could feel building. "I'd like to make a deposit and open a new account, please." Rebecca's smile barely reached her eyes as she glanced at Sarah's casual attire. "Do you currently have an account with us?" she asked, her tone polite, but the subtle skepticism beneath it was impossible to miss. "No, this would be a new relationship," Sarah responded, placing a large check into a folder on the desk. "It's for the Johnson Educational Foundation. We're establishing a new program that requires a separate account." Rebecca's eyebrows raised slightly as she glanced at the check. The six-figure amount on the deposit caught her attention, and her initial indifference shifted to suspicion. Her lips pressed together, and her eyes narrowed as she processed what she had just heard. "That's a substantial deposit," Rebecca said, her voice louder now. She didn't take the check, instead eyeing it as if it were a foreign object, something that didn't belong in this space. "May I ask where these funds originated?" "The foundation raised these funds through our annual benefit," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the prickling feeling she had in her chest. "All the documentation is here, including our 501c3 certification." Rebecca glanced at the check again, then at Sarah, her expression becoming more pointed. "I'm sorry, but we don't typically establish accounts of this magnitude without proper verification," she said, her voice carrying more authority than before. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about our institution's requirements?" Sarah, though uncomfortable, maintained her composure. "The Foundation's CFO called ahead to confirm the process. We were told all the necessary documentation was included." Rebecca's smile tightened, her gaze becoming more critical. "Ms. Johnson," she began, her tone now unmistakably dismissive, "Atlantic National serves a particular clientele. Our high-net-worth customers expect a certain environment." She gestured vaguely at Sarah's attire. "I'm not convinced this is the right banking relationship for someone of your profile." The words hung in the air like a slap, the accusation clear in its delivery. A few customers nearby glanced up from their transactions, sensing the growing tension. Sarah's cheeks flushed as she processed the sting of the remark, but she refused to let it show. She could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the discomfort in the air. "Is there a problem with the documentation?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter now, though still steady. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a stage whisper, still audible to those in the vicinity. "Let's be direct. This check is for $250,000. People who handle legitimate transactions of that size generally don't show up looking like they have just come from the gym. It raises questions." The words struck Sarah like a blow. The implication was clear. Sarah's worth, her legitimacy, was being questioned because of her appearance. It wasn't the first time she had encountered such bias, but it stung just the same. She didn't know what to say in response. Everything she had worked for, all the children she had helped, suddenly felt irrelevant in the face of Rebecca's narrow judgment. "The Johnson Educational Foundation is completely legitimate," Sarah said, her voice now betraying a hint of frustration. "We've been operating for 5 years and have helped over 10,000 children." Rebecca didn't seem moved. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice now sharp. "Perhaps you should try a different institution, one more accustomed to dealing with your type of clientele," she said, her eyes narrowing as she delivered the thinly veiled threat. "I'd hate for us to need to escalate this situation." Sarah stood frozen, the blood draining from her face as the full weight of the situation settled over her. She had been humiliated, publicly dismissed, all because of how she looked. The murmurs of nearby customers grew louder, and Sarah became acutely aware of every eye in the room. She could feel her breath catch in her throat as the injustice of it all took hold. At that moment, Daniel's voice drifted to her ears, the sudden change in the atmosphere unmistakable. He had finished his call and was now walking across the lobby, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. A wave of relief washed over Sarah. Finally, someone would speak up. Finally, someone who understood. Daniel Morgan's eyes narrowed as he saw the scene unfolding in front of him. From across the marble-floored lobby, he could already tell something was wrong. Sarah's posture was stiff, her face flushed, and Rebecca Palmer's pointed finger aimed directly at his wife. The atmosphere around them seemed charged, with nearby customers awkwardly glancing between Sarah and the bank manager. Something was happening, something that went beyond a mere bank transaction, and Daniel felt the stirrings of anger rising in his chest. He had been discussing investment strategies with his team in Singapore when he heard the tension in the air. His first instinct was to continue the call, but something about the scene in front of him made him pause. He saw the way Rebecca leaned in, her voice low but cutting through the air with authority, and Sarah's composed but visibly shaken demeanor. His protective instincts kicked in as he ended the call abruptly, his mind already racing. As he walked towards Sarah, the soft clacking of his polished shoes echoed in the quiet lobby. Each step seemed to reverberate against the marble, a stark contrast to the hushed murmurs of the bystanders who had begun to gather. The security guard stood a little straighter as he passed, and the bank associate who had been looking nervously at the exchange quickly looked down, uncomfortable in the midst of the tension. Daniel's measured steps cut through the palpable silence, and he could feel the shift in energy as he drew closer. He wasn't just Daniel Morgan, the wealthy businessman. Here, in this moment, he was her husband. The one who had watched Sarah pour her heart and soul into her foundation, the one who knew the sacrifices she had made. He had seen her work tirelessly to improve the lives of children, giving them opportunities they would never have had otherwise. When he reached Sarah, he paused for just a moment, taking in the full extent of what was happening. Rebecca's finger was still directed at Sarah, her stance arrogant, as though she held all the power in this situation. Sarah, meanwhile, stood tall, despite the sting of humiliation. Daniel could feel his blood begin to boil as he placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. The moment he made contact, she looked at him, relief evident on her face. But Rebecca, still unaware of who Daniel truly was, continued her tirade. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority that had been the backbone of his career. Rebecca's gaze flickered up, irritation flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the immaculate navy suit Daniel wore and the platinum watch that glinted in the light. Her eyes widened ever so slightly as she realized who was standing before her. Daniel's expression remained neutral, the calm of a man who had navigated far more high-stakes situations than this one, but the tension in his eyes was clear. "I believe you're handling a situation with my wife." For a brief moment, the room fell silent as the gravity of the words sank in. Rebecca's smile faltered. Her face underwent a remarkable transformation, confusion giving way to recognition, and then a look of horror as she finally understood the magnitude of the mistake she had made. Her voice cracked slightly as she repeated, "Your wife?" "Yes," Daniel replied, his tone still even. "Sarah Johnson, founder of the Johnson Educational Foundation. She's here to make a deposit for a new literacy program." Rebecca's mouth went dry as she glanced from Sarah's casual attire back to Daniel's tailored suit. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, and as they did, she found herself caught in a trap of her own making. The realization spread across her face like a storm cloud, and the weight of her earlier judgment seemed to press down on her. Before she could formulate a response, Daniel's next words cut through the tension. "I see she's making the deposit for our new literacy program," he continued, his voice still calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. Rebecca's hands fluttered nervously, her professional demeanor slipping away. She knew now that this wasn't just any situation. It was a mistake of monumental proportions. Rebecca's face drained of color as she realized the depth of her blunder. The pieces clicked together in her mind, and the significance of the moment settled over her like a heavy weight. She had no idea that the woman she had dismissed so carelessly was married to one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city, the very man whose investments had secured Atlantic National Bank as a premier institution in the financial world. "Mr. Morgan," Rebecca stammered, her voice faltering, I had no idea." Daniel's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering. His tone, still calm, cut through the panic now creeping into her voice. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? You had no idea. You judged my wife based on her appearance, not on her worth, not on the legitimacy of her work." Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but the words failed her. She knew she had crossed a line, and no amount of professional training could undo the damage she had just done. The power dynamics in the room had shifted entirely. Daniel, with his quiet authority, was in control, and Rebecca was now the one on the defensive. From across the room, a young bank associate, Thomas, had been quietly observing the exchange. He had been uncomfortable from the moment Sarah walked in, sensing the judgment in the air. But now, watching Rebecca's crumbling composure, he knew the situation was far more serious than anyone could have anticipated. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, as if he, too, was part of something larger, something that demanded a change. Daniel turned his attention to Sarah, who stood beside him, still processing the situation. He could feel the subtle tremble in her shoulders, a quiet indication of the emotional toll this moment had taken on her. But she remained composed, her strength evident in the way she held herself despite the humiliation. "You were about to refuse this deposit," Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving Rebecca. "All because of a preconceived notion about how someone like my wife should look. But what you didn't see, what you failed to understand, is that the work she does, real, meaningful work, is changing lives. And you almost turned her away because she didn't meet your expectations of what a donor should look like." Rebecca's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize," she tried to explain, but it sounded weak, almost desperate. Sarah spoke up, her voice steady and unwavering. "The problem isn't just what happened here today. The problem is that this bank and others like it often make judgments based on appearances. You assumed I didn't belong, simply because I wasn't dressed in a suit. But my foundation has helped thousands of children, children who are overlooked by people who think like you." Daniel nodded, his gaze still locked on Rebecca. "This goes beyond today. It's about the people who don't have the luxury of a tailored suit or a platinum watch. It's about how we, as a society, too often judge others by their appearance and their status, instead of their character." Rebecca stood frozen, caught in the realization that her own actions had just exposed the flaws in her worldview. She had always prided herself on being the professional, someone who adhered strictly to the rules. But here she was, having failed to see beyond the surface, and now her career, and possibly her future at the bank, hung in the balance. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps it's time you did," Sarah replied, her voice cool but not unkind. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of the moment was not lost on anyone in the room. Daniel could feel the eyes of every person in the lobby now fixed on them, the spectacle of Sarah's public humiliation slowly giving way to something more profound, an opportunity for change. Thomas, still standing off to the side, stepped forward with a quiet but respectful voice. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his words carrying a sincerity that Rebecca had lacked, "if you don't mind, I'd be honored to complete the paperwork for your foundation's account. I've heard about your literacy programs, and honestly, I think what you're doing is incredible." Sarah looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice a bit warmer now. "It means a lot to hear that." Rebecca's head snapped up as she heard Thomas speak. There was a part of her that was embarrassed by the contrast between his genuine respect and her own earlier behavior. And for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong about more than just Sarah. Daniel watched the interaction carefully and then turned back to Walter Thompson, the bank's president, who had been silently observing from his office. Walter's eyes met Daniel's, and without a word he walked toward them, his steps firm and purposeful. The tension in the room seemed to heighten with every moment, as everyone waited for what would come next. Walter addressed Rebecca first, his voice grave. "Rebecca, I'm afraid we'll need to have a discussion in my office. Please gather your things." Rebecca looked as though she might protest, but one glance from Daniel stopped her in her tracks. There was no need for further words. The consequences of her actions were already unfolding before her eyes. "Thomas," Walter continued, his voice carrying an authoritative tone, "please make sure the necessary paperwork for the Johnson Educational Foundation is processed immediately." As Thomas nodded and moved to help Sarah with the deposit, Daniel turned to Sarah, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft now, the tension beginning to ease. Sarah gave him a small but grateful smile. "I'm fine. Just, I didn't expect it to play out like this." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted, his voice low. "But maybe this will be the start of something better, something that could change how people are treated." Not just here, but everywhere. As they walked toward Walter's office, Daniel couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. The day had started with a simple deposit, but it had quickly become something much more significant. A turning point for Sarah, for Rebecca, and for Atlantic National itself. The tension in the air was palpable as Daniel and Sarah entered the private office of Walter Thompson, the bank's president. The plush leather chairs and expansive mahogany desk were an imposing reminder of the wealth and power that Atlantic National Bank represented. But today, the atmosphere felt different. What had started as a routine deposit had quickly turned into a confrontation that none of them had anticipated. Walter's expression was grave as he closed the door behind them, his usual polished demeanor replaced by something more serious. His eyes briefly flickered toward Rebecca Palmer, who had just stepped out of the room, her face pale with embarrassment. There was no mistaking the weight of her failure, and Daniel could feel the shift in power dynamics, not just in the room, but in the entire institution. "Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Johnson," Walter began, his voice calm but heavy with the realization of how badly the situation had spiraled. "I want to apologize for what happened. This is unacceptable. Rebecca's actions today were a clear misstep, and I assure you this will be dealt with." Daniel nodded, his arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the wall. He could feel Sarah's hand resting lightly on his arm, her touch a silent reminder of everything they had been through together. The calm in the room contrasted sharply with the storm that had just erupted in the bank's lobby. "Rebecca's judgment was deeply flawed," Daniel said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "But I don't just want an apology. I want to know what this institution plans to do to ensure something like this never happens again." Sarah stood quietly beside him, her gaze fixed on Walter. She didn't speak, but her presence in the room was enough. She had been the one to face the humiliation. She had been the one dismissed by someone who should have known better. And now, as they faced Walter, Sarah's quiet strength was evident. She wasn't just seeking a resolution, she was seeking change. Walter hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "We will conduct a full internal review," he said finally, his voice measured. "There will be consequences for Rebecca, and I intend to ensure that all our staff are retrained on how to treat clients with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or wealth." Sarah's eyes flickered with a hint of skepticism. "And what about the culture here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room with a quiet but firm resolve. "How many other people have been turned away or treated unfairly because they didn't meet some arbitrary standard?" Walter shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk as he processed her words. For a moment it seemed like he was genuinely considering the magnitude of the question. "I'll admit," he said after a long pause, "that there are aspects of our culture that need to be examined. But I assure you, we're committed to making changes. This incident has opened my eyes, and I think it has done the same for many others here." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's a start," he said, his tone skeptical but hopeful. "But talk is cheap. Actions speak louder." Sarah's voice softened slightly, her eyes steady on Walter. "What exactly are you planning to do?" she asked, her words measured but filled with a quiet determination. Walter sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The room was heavy with expectation, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. What he said next would determine how the rest of this encounter would unfold, not just for Sarah and Daniel, but for the entire institution. "I propose," he began slowly, "that we create a community banking initiative, one that focuses on supporting nonprofits and individuals who may not fit the traditional profile of our clients. We will remove barriers, simplify processes, and most importantly, ensure that everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, receives the same level of respect and service." Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. This was the kind of change they had hoped for. It was a beginning, not just for the bank, but for a broader shift in how institutions like Atlantic National viewed the world. It was a move toward inclusion, toward breaking down the invisible barriers that had kept so many people at arm's length. "This is a good start, Walter," Sarah said, her voice softening, but her resolve still firm. "But it can't be just about words. You need to follow through. I want to see measurable progress. We'll be watching closely." Walter nodded, understanding the gravity of Sarah's words. I understand, he said. We'll make this happen. I'll get the ball rolling right away. As the conversation shifted toward the details of the initiative, Daniel and Sarah remained focused, knowing that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But this moment, this decision to take action, marked a turning point not just for the bank, but for a new approach to banking that could ripple out into the community. The quiet hum of the room seemed to grow louder as the weight of the conversation settled. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about something much larger. And for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that things could, indeed, be different. Walter's expression grew more thoughtful as he leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him. I believe we can make this change meaningful, he said, his voice carrying a newfound resolve. We will start by implementing comprehensive bias training for all staff members, focusing not just on clients with high net worth profiles, but on everyone. I've already seen the cracks in the system, and I'm committed to addressing them. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze steady but searching. That's a good step forward, he said. But it's not just about retraining staff. It's about ensuring that this initiative isn't a temporary fix. You need to create a system that holds everyone accountable, not just in words but in practice. What's in place to prevent this kind of judgment from creeping back in? Sarah's words had already begun to resonate in the room. As much as Walter was taking responsibility for the issue at hand, the magnitude of the situation was beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't about one employee's lapse in judgment. This was about an ingrained culture that needed to evolve if it was going to survive in a rapidly changing world. We're working on creating a set of clear policies, Walter said, his voice more measured now. We'll have regular check-ins and audits to ensure that these new practices are followed. There will also be an emphasis on empathy and respect, especially when it comes to interacting with clients who might not fit the traditional mold of our typical clientele. Sarah's expression softened, but only slightly. She was far from convinced, but she was willing to listen. I want to see something tangible, Walter. I want to know that your team is committed to making this a long-term change. Not just a few months of training, but a full overhaul of how things are done. Walter stood up from his desk, walking over to a large window that overlooked the bustling streets of the city. He stood there for a long moment, contemplating Sarah's words. The weight of the decision was heavy, and he knew that the steps he was about to take would require more than just surface-level changes. The success of this initiative depended on the willingness of the bank to face its own shortcomings. We'll make sure of that, he said, turning back to face them. In fact, I'm going to personally oversee the launch of the Community Banking Initiative. I want this to be a new chapter for Atlantic National, one that's rooted in inclusion, not exclusivity. Sarah exchanged a glance with Daniel, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, there was a shared understanding between them. This was the beginning of something bigger than they had expected. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would likely be setbacks, but there was now a clear path forward, a path that could reshape not just the bank, but the way people in this city viewed success, wealth, and community. Good, Daniel said, his voice steady. We'll hold you to that, Walter, and we'll be here to support the initiative. But you need to lead the charge. This is about more than just doing the right thing. It's about showing the world that institutions like yours can be a force for good. I understand, Walter replied, his voice firm with conviction, and I will make it happen. As the meeting concluded, Sarah and Daniel walked out of Walter's office with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle hadn't been won in full, but the tide had begun to turn. As they stepped back into the lobby, the weight of what had just transpired settled on them both. For Sarah, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a chance to create lasting change, not only for her foundation, but for communities like the ones she fought for every day. Outside, the world seemed to move faster than ever, but for Sarah, there was a renewed sense of purpose. She had always believed that change was possible, no matter how entrenched the systems were. Today, she had taken the first step toward proving that. And for once, she felt a deep, unwavering conviction that the work she was doing was in fact changing lives. Not just the lives of children she helped, but the lives of everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was the start of a new chapter, and Sarah Johnson was ready to lead the way. The days following the meeting with Walter Thompson passed in a blur of action. Sarah and Daniel spent countless hours strategizing with their team, refining the vision for the community banking initiative. They wanted it to be more than just a project. It needed to represent a fundamental shift in how institutions treated people from all walks of life. No longer would wealth or appearance define someone's worth. They were determined to make Atlantic National a model of inclusivity, a beacon of change in a world too often defined by financial status. Sarah had always been a woman of action, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her foundation anymore. It was about challenging an entire system, about shifting the culture of an institution that had long been one of the most prestigious in the city. She knew the road ahead would be full of obstacles, but she was ready for the challenge. One afternoon, Sarah sat down in her office with a steaming cup of coffee, a folder filled with early drafts of the initiative's proposals laid out in front of her. Daniel was busy with calls, and she found herself lost in thought as she reviewed the documents. The more she read, the more she realized just how much work was still ahead. The details of the initiative were beginning to take shape, but the real challenge would be in ensuring that the bank staff not only understood, but embraced the new vision. She was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Looking up, she saw Thomas standing in the doorway, his face a little nervous but determined. Sarah had noticed the young man's quiet but steadfast presence over the last few weeks, and she could see that he had become a supporter of the change they were trying to implement. "Mrs. Johnson," Thomas said, stepping into the room, "I just wanted to check in with you. I've been thinking about the initiative a lot, and I'd love to help in any way I can." Sarah smiled, surprised by his initiative. "I appreciate that, Thomas. I know you've been busy with your own tasks, but your enthusiasm means a lot." "I believe in what you're doing," he said, his voice steady. "The literacy program, what it's doing for kids, has made such a difference for my sister. I just want to help make sure this program has the chance to really change things for everyone, not just the people who can afford the luxury of banking here." His words hit Sarah deeply. This wasn't just about money or about policy. It was about real people, real lives, and the opportunity to give them something they'd never had before. A chance at a future that wasn't limited by their background or their appearance. She looked at him with a deep sense of gratitude. "I'm glad to hear that," Sarah said. "If you're willing to help, we'll need all the support we can get. This initiative will only work if it's led by people who believe in the mission as much as we do." Thomas nodded, determination in his eyes. "I'm ready. What's next?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful as she considered Thomas's offer. He had proven himself capable, diligent, and, most importantly, genuinely aligned with the mission they were striving for. She could tell that he wasn't just looking to advance his own career, but to be part of something bigger than himself. That kind of dedication was rare, and it was exactly what they needed. "There's a lot to be done," Sarah said, her tone both serious and optimistic. "We need to start developing a detailed outreach strategy. The Foundation's work has always been about reaching those who've been left out, those who don't fit into the traditional systems. The bank needs to learn how to welcome those people with open arms, no matter where they come from or what they wear." Thomas nodded, his eyes lighting up at the thought. "What if we start with the schools? We could partner with local schools in underserved neighborhoods and set up financial literacy workshops. Not only would it align with the bank's new initiative, but it would introduce young people to the idea of financial empowerment." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. It was exactly the type of program she had hoped for, one that would make a lasting impact by reaching children before they became adults with entrenched financial habits. If they could teach kids the power of financial knowledge early on, they would help them break free from cycles of poverty and give them a stronger foundation for the future. "That's a fantastic idea," Sarah said, leaning forward, her hands clasped together. "We could also introduce them to career paths in banking and finance. Many of these kids have never even considered a career in finance, much less worked at a bank like Atlantic National. But if they could see themselves in these roles, well, that's the kind of future we're talking about." Thomas smiled, clearly encouraged by Sarah's enthusiasm. "And it's not just about teaching them finance, right? It's about showing them that a place like this," he gestured to the building around them, "isn't beyond their reach. It's about changing the perception that people like them don't belong here." Exactly, Sarah thought. It wasn't just about providing opportunities, it was about changing the narrative. It was about showing kids that they didn't need to dress in expensive clothes or speak a certain way to be taken seriously. They deserved respect, they deserved access, and most importantly, they deserved a chance. The conversation continued as they fleshed out ideas for the program, reaching out to local community leaders, connecting with schools, and finding ways to integrate the initiative into the bank's daily operations. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The bank was still recovering from the negative press around Sarah's initial mistreatment. But they also knew that this initiative, if executed correctly, could not only change the bank's image, but also have a profound, lasting impact on the communities they served. As they wrapped up their discussion, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in a long time. The work ahead was daunting, but it was meaningful. She glanced at Thomas, who was already scribbling down ideas for the next steps, his focus unwavering. She had no doubt that, with people like him by her side, they could make a difference. "We're going to need your help every step of the way," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. "But I believe we can do this, and we will. Together." Thomas gave her a confident nod, his expression resolute. "I'm with you, Mrs. Johnson. Let's make this happen." With that, Sarah felt a quiet but powerful sense of excitement settle in her chest. She wasn't just leading a foundation anymore. She was leading a movement that could change the way people saw each other, the way institutions treated their clients, and the way future generations viewed opportunity. And as they moved forward, she knew that this was only the beginning. The Community Banking Initiative was officially launched, and Sarah stood in front of the gathered employees at Atlantic National's headquarters, ready to deliver a speech that she had been rehearsing for weeks. The atmosphere in the room was filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Many of the staff had heard about the new direction the bank was taking, but not all of them were convinced. It had been a month since Walter Thompson's promise to overhaul the bank's culture, and this meeting marked the beginning of the bank's shift toward inclusivity and broader community engagement. Sarah looked out at the audience, her gaze sweeping over the faces of employees, some familiar and some she hadn't yet met. Daniel stood beside her, his supportive presence a constant source of strength. But this was her moment to speak, to set the tone for what was to come. She knew that this would be more than just a speech. It would be a turning point for both the bank and the communities they hoped to reach. "Thank you all for being here today," Sarah began, her voice calm yet firm. "I know that many of you are uncertain about what this shift will mean, both for you as employees and for the bank as a whole. But I want to assure you that the path we are embarking on is not just a moral one. It's a necessary one. It's about creating a bank that serves everyone, regardless of their background or appearance." The room fell silent as Sarah's words sank in. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of her presence in a room full of people who had, at some point, believed that wealth and status were the only things that mattered. Sarah was here to challenge that belief, to turn it on its head. She had lived her entire life fighting for those who had been overlooked or dismissed, and now she had the opportunity to create a space where that same mindset could thrive within the walls of one of the city's most prestigious banks. "As you all know, our mission is to bring real change to the way we do business," she continued. "It's about more than just numbers. It's about human lives. Our goal is to break down barriers, to ensure that everyone, regardless of their financial standing, feels welcome here. No one should ever feel like they don't belong, simply because they don't fit a certain mold." Sarah paused, letting her words resonate in the room. She could feel the shift in the energy of the room. Some faces still showed skepticism, but others seemed to soften. This was a new kind of challenge. They weren't just changing policies, they were changing perceptions. It was going to take time, but Sarah was confident that they were on the right path. "As part of this initiative," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, "we're going to start by partnering with schools in underserved communities. Our goal is to teach financial literacy to children who may not have access to the resources and guidance that others take for granted. This is just the beginning. We are also launching workshops that will focus on empowering families who don't have the privilege of traditional banking relationships. Together, we're going to create real, lasting change in the lives of people who have long been overlooked." The audience was now fully engaged, some nodding in agreement, others leaning forward to catch every word. Sarah's heart quickened as she saw the shift in the room. This was what she had been fighting for. This was the moment when things could truly begin to change. But she also knew that the real work was only just beginning. There will be challenges ahead, she acknowledged. There will be doubts. Not everyone will see this vision the way we do. But we have to be brave enough to stand by it, to take risks. Because the truth is, change never happens without resistance. We've already seen how a small act of judgment can affect lives. But if we are committed to ensuring that every person who walks through these doors is treated with respect, regardless of their income, their clothes, or their background, we will start to see the kind of transformation that matters. She could feel the energy shift again, this time more powerfully. There was a noticeable shift in the body language of the employees. Some were straightening in their seats, others exchanging quick, uncertain glances. But the atmosphere had definitely changed. For the first time, Sarah could see that the seeds of the initiative were beginning to take root. Daniel stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, his gesture both supportive and symbolic. "I've seen the incredible work my wife does with the foundation," he said, his voice firm but warm. "And I know that with your commitment, this bank can do the same kind of work. This is not just a corporate initiative. This is a chance to make a difference in real people's lives. If we can change the culture here, if we can open our doors to people who have always been excluded, then we will have done something truly extraordinary." As Daniel spoke, Sarah watched the room again. The words, simple as they were, seemed to sink into the crowd. She could feel their eyes shifting from skepticism to curiosity, from doubt to something more open, more willing. The first steps had been taken. The transformation had begun. "This isn't just about what we can do for others," Sarah finished, her eyes sweeping over the room. "It's about what they can do for us. People who've been excluded, who've been treated like they don't matter. When we bring them into our fold, they will change us too. They will remind us of the things that truly matter: empathy, respect, and understanding. And together, we'll build a better future for everyone." The applause was hesitant at first, but it grew. Sarah could hear the quiet murmurs of conversation as people began to digest her words. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but today she had planted the seeds of change. The first signs of change at Atlantic National were subtle. At the beginning, it was just a few employees attending the financial literacy workshops Sarah had championed. Then slowly, more people from the community began to show up. Families eager to learn how to better manage their finances, children with curious eyes soaking in every word of the lesson. Sarah watched it all unfold from the sidelines, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. The initiative was making a real impact, but there was still so much work to be done. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself drawn into meetings with Walter Thompson and the senior leadership team, strategizing on how to integrate the new community-focused model into the bank's core operations. The groundwork had been laid, but now it was time for the real work, the difficult, often messy task of shifting the bank's deeply ingrained culture. Walter had been true to his word. He had taken the initiative seriously, and soon after Sarah's speech, there was an organizational restructuring in the bank's operations. The focus wasn't just on bringing in high-net-worth clients, but also on welcoming people from diverse backgrounds, people who had historically been pushed to the margins of the financial world. It was a challenge, of course. The old guard had their doubts. Some of the employees who had spent years working in the exclusive world of wealth management were resistant to the idea of serving clients who didn't fit the traditional mold. Sarah knew that it was going to take time, but she was determined to see this through. She had spent her entire life fighting for those who had been overlooked, for the people who didn't fit into society's narrow definitions of success. This was the moment to make a real, lasting difference, and she wasn't about to back down. One afternoon, as she sat in her office going through the latest round of reports on the initiative's progress, there was a soft knock at the door. Sarah looked up to see Thomas standing there, holding a folder in his hand. He looked excited, a spark of energy that was contagious. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. He handed her the folder. "The outreach program is really taking off. We've already partnered with 5 more schools, and the response has been incredible. We're getting more families involved than we thought possible." Sarah took the folder and flipped through it quickly, her eyes scanning the data. It was better than she had expected. More schools, more workshops, and a growing list of families eager to participate. She could already see the ripple effect that the initiative was creating. This was exactly the momentum they needed to prove that change was possible, that this bank wasn't just a symbol of wealth, but a force for good. Sarah smiled, feeling a surge of hope as she processed the numbers in front of her. "This is incredible, Thomas. It's even better than I imagined," she said, glancing up at him. "We're reaching the families who need this the most, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. It's exactly what we set out to do." Thomas's eyes shone with excitement, but there was also a sense of pride in his expression. "I think people are beginning to trust us more. They can see that we're genuinely committed to making a difference, not just ticking boxes for PR. And it's not just about financial literacy. It's about building relationships with these communities, showing them that they belong here." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her thoughts momentarily drifting. She knew Thomas was right. This wasn't just about numbers and reports. It was about the real connections they were forming, the trust they were rebuilding with communities that had been neglected for so long. But even with all the progress they had made, she knew there were still obstacles ahead. "The tough part," Sarah began, "is that we need to maintain this momentum. We need to ensure that the people who are benefiting from these programs continue to feel valued by the bank, that they know this isn't just a temporary initiative. This needs to be sustainable. And we have to make sure that the culture shift within the bank becomes permanent, not just a passing trend." Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I get it. We've made great strides, but the real test will be whether we can continue this on a larger scale. We need to show that it's not just good for business, it's the right thing to do." Just then, the door to her office opened and Daniel stepped inside. His presence always brought a sense of calm to her, a steady reminder of why she was fighting for this change. He had been deeply involved in the behind-the-scenes work of the initiative, helping to secure funding and ensure that the bank's leadership remained on board. "How's it going in here?" Daniel asked, his voice warm as he walked over to her desk. Sarah stood and gave him a brief hug. "It's going better than I expected," she said, holding up the folder. "Look at this. We've expanded the outreach program more quickly than we anticipated. People are responding to it in ways we didn't think possible." Daniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the pride he felt for the work they were doing. "That's fantastic," he said, taking a seat beside her. "I knew it would catch on, but seeing it in action is something else. You're really making a difference, Sarah." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward Daniel. His unwavering support had been crucial in keeping her focused during the moments of doubt. He had always believed in her vision, even when others questioned it. "We're making progress, but it's just the beginning," Sarah said, her tone serious. "We still have a lot of work to do to change the hearts and minds of those who have been resistant to this shift. It won't happen overnight." Thomas spoke up again, his enthusiasm undimmed. "We've got a solid foundation now, and with the feedback we're getting from the community, I really think we're on the verge of something huge." Sarah smiled at him, feeling the weight of the moment. "You're right, Thomas. We have the momentum, but we need to stay focused. The real test will come when we start seeing long-term results, when people feel like they're truly part of something bigger." She looked at Daniel, who gave her a knowing look. It was the same look he had given her when they first started the foundation, when they were still trying to build something out of nothing. The road had been long, but they had built something real, something that had already begun to change lives. "We'll stay focused," Daniel said, "and we'll keep pushing forward." Sarah nodded, feeling more certain than ever that they were on the right path. There would be setbacks, of course. There always were. But she had faith in the work they were doing, in the people they were reaching, and in the change they were beginning to create. Together, they could turn this vision into a reality. Together, they could transform not just the bank, but the communities they served. And that thought gave Sarah the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Atlantic National's conference room, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The atmosphere was tense, a sharp contrast to the usual calm that had come to define Sarah's meetings. Today, she was standing at the front of the room, flanked by Daniel and a handful of key leadership members, ready to address the bank's senior staff. It was a critical moment, one that would test whether the new direction they were pushing for could truly take root. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of progress. Workshops were being held at local schools, and the financial literacy initiative had gained more traction than anyone had expected. But beneath the success, there was still an undercurrent of resistance within the bank, particularly from those who had been entrenched in the old ways of doing business. The ones who still saw themselves as the gatekeepers of wealth and believed that their clients should look a certain way, dress a certain way, and act a certain way. Sarah knew that today would be pivotal. She needed to convince these individuals that this wasn't just a passing trend, but a necessary evolution. The shift toward inclusivity couldn't just be a buzzword. It had to become a part of the bank's DNA. She could already feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. But she wasn't nervous. She was resolute. As we all know, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady, the foundation of this bank was built on serving a very specific kind of clientele. But today, the world is different. The people we serve today are not just those with the most wealth. They are families, children, and communities who have been left behind by traditional banking systems. She paused, scanning the room. There were a few nods of acknowledgement, but she could tell that some were still skeptical. Their faces were unreadable, but their posture said it all. Change was always uncomfortable, especially when it threatened to disrupt the established order. We've made tremendous progress with our community outreach, Sarah continued. Our workshops are reaching more families than we ever thought possible, and that's only the beginning. But the true test of this initiative is not in the numbers. It's in the culture we create within these walls. Sarah's gaze shifted to Walter Thompson, who was sitting in the front row, his expression unreadable. She knew he had been a strong ally, but this meeting was about ensuring that the entire leadership team was on board with the new vision. Real change comes when we treat every customer, regardless of their appearance or financial standing, with the same level of respect and service. It's not just about what's good for business, it's about doing what's right. There was a slight shift in the room. Some people straightened, others exchanged looks. Sarah could feel the tension beginning to shift, and that gave her a small sense of hope. Sarah's words hung in the air, the room silent as everyone absorbed the weight of what she had said. The culture shift that she was advocating for was no small task, and she knew that convincing the entire leadership team was going to take more than just powerful speeches. It was going to take commitment, follow-through, and perhaps most importantly, patience. Walter Thompson stood up, his tall frame commanding attention as he addressed the group. "Sarah's right," he began, his voice carrying a sense of authority that made the room hush. "This initiative is more than just a business strategy. It's about redefining what we stand for as a bank. It's about serving people who have been ignored for too long, and it's about ensuring that we're part of the solution, not the problem." He looked around at the senior staff, meeting their gazes one by one. Some of them nodded in agreement, while others remained impassive, unsure of how to react. Sarah knew that Walter's words were important, but the real challenge was in what came next. They couldn't just rely on good intentions. They needed a clear plan, actionable steps that everyone could get behind. "I'm fully committed to this shift," Walter continued, "and I expect each of you to be as well. We'll be restructuring our approach to client relations, and there will be a new focus on inclusive banking practices that better serve a broader demographic. Our new outreach programs are just the beginning. It's time we look at how we can reshape our internal policies and operations to better reflect this commitment." Sarah glanced at Daniel, who had been quietly observing from the side. She could see the pride in his eyes, but she also knew that there were still many hurdles ahead. They had started to make progress, but the real work was in the follow-through, in ensuring that these changes weren't just words on paper, but a new way of doing business. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing logistics, how to roll out the changes, how to measure success, and how to handle potential pushback from both clients and employees. It was clear that there were many moving pieces, but Sarah was determined to keep pushing forward. As the meeting came to a close, Walter addressed the group one last time. "This is a historic moment for us," he said, "and it's up to all of us to make sure that it becomes a permanent change, not just a trend." The room remained still as the final words of the meeting settled in. Sarah felt the weight of the responsibility ahead, but she also felt a sense of determination rise within her. This was just the beginning, but with the support of people like Daniel, Walter, and the growing number of dedicated employees, she was confident they could make a lasting impact. As everyone filed out of the conference room, Sarah lingered for a moment, her mind racing with the next steps. The work was far from over, but she knew that if they stayed true to their vision, they could create a banking institution that reflected the values of empathy, inclusivity, and respect. And that, she believed, was something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed the senior leadership meeting were filled with intense action. Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to build on the momentum they had started, fleshing out the details of the community banking initiative. They were meeting with local schools, preparing outreach programs, and drafting new policies for the bank. But as Sarah sat in her office, poring over the latest drafts of their plans, she felt a growing sense of unease. The work was important, yes, but it was also daunting. They were trying to create a paradigm shift within one of the most traditional institutions in the city, and that wasn't going to happen overnight. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the bustling street outside her window. The city had always been a place of possibility, but lately, it felt as though the challenges ahead were beginning to outweigh the excitement. There was so much to do, and the pressure was building, especially with the high expectations that had been set by the leadership team. Sarah knew they needed to show progress, not just in numbers, but in how they were impacting the communities they had promised to serve. She also knew that resistance was inevitable, and that some of it was already surfacing from within the bank itself. "Hey, everything okay?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts as he stepped into the room, his presence always grounding her in moments like this. Sarah smiled faintly and gestured to the stack of papers on her desk. "Just working on the final touches for the upcoming presentations to the schools. It's a lot to handle, but we're making progress. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we're being tested every step of the way." Daniel walked over, sitting down beside her. "I get it. You've been pushing hard and it's not easy, but I see the change happening already. Just look at how far we've come in such a short time. People are starting to listen." Sarah nodded, but still felt the weight of doubt hanging over her. It's not just about getting them to listen, though. It's about getting them to believe that this isn't just a phase or a temporary trend. We need to prove that this initiative is something that's going to last, something that will change how people think about banking. Daniel took a deep breath, considering her words. "I know, but I think the real test is going to come when we start seeing the impact, not just in numbers, but in the stories, the real people who will benefit from this." Sarah's eyes softened at the thought. She was right. Change could only be measured by the lives it touched, and she had seen the potential in the faces of the people they were already reaching. Daniel's words hung in the air as Sarah thought about the families they had met through the financial literacy workshops and the community outreach efforts. She could already see the difference they were making, even if it was just a ripple in the larger sea of societal change. Those stories, the ones where families were finally gaining access to tools and resources they had been denied for so long, were the very reason she kept going. She looked at him, a renewed sense of clarity in her eyes. "You're right. It's about those stories, the ones we haven't even heard yet. They're going to be the heart of this whole thing." Daniel smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Exactly. And we'll get there. We just need to stay focused and keep pushing forward." As Sarah took in his words, a sudden realization hit her. She stood up, her mind racing as she paced around the office. The banks and institutions they were trying to change weren't just made up of policies and numbers. It was the people, the employees, the clients, the community that truly defined its culture. This wasn't just a project, it was a movement. But to sustain that movement, they had to turn the tide within the bank itself. There were still skeptics, still people who saw this initiative as a passing fad or a publicity stunt. "I need to do more than just speak at these meetings," Sarah said, her voice filled with newfound determination. "We need to involve the entire staff in this process. They need to feel connected to the cause. It's not enough for them to just accept this on the surface. They need to believe in it." Daniel's brow furrowed as he thought about her words. "What do you have in mind?" "Training sessions," Sarah replied quickly. "More than just the basic diversity training. We need to dig deep, show them how to truly engage with people from different walks of life. Help them see the faces behind the statistics. Make it personal. If we want the bank to really embrace this change, we need to get everyone on board, from the tellers to the executives. Daniel nodded in agreement. That's a great idea. If we want this to last, we need everyone to understand the bigger picture, not just the bottom line. Sarah paused, a sense of purpose filling her. She knew it was going to be a challenge, but it was the kind of challenge she had been waiting for. The work was far from done, but she had a renewed sense of conviction. The road ahead was still long, but with each step, they were breaking down barriers and opening doors to a future that could change the way banking and society worked. The Community Banking Initiative was beginning to take on a life of its own. Weeks of hard work and relentless effort were starting to show visible results. Sarah watched as more families came through the doors of Atlantic National, eager to participate in financial literacy workshops, to ask questions, and to begin their journey toward financial empowerment. The faces of these families, different ages, backgrounds, and experiences, reminded Sarah why she had started this fight in the first place. Yet despite all the success, there was still a lingering feeling of uncertainty. It wasn't just the financial side of things that worried her, but the cultural shift. Sarah knew that for this change to be sustainable, it had to be ingrained deeply within the bank's culture. The bank's employees, many of whom had worked in traditional, high-net-worth circles their entire careers, were still adjusting to this new model. Some had fully embraced the new direction, but others remained skeptical, questioning whether this shift could truly be lasting or if it was merely a trend. Sarah had heard the whispers, the quiet conversations about whether this community banking initiative was just another PR stunt or if it was truly a reflection of the bank's values. It was the doubt of those employees who still clung to the old ways that worried her. The road to transforming this institution was far from smooth, and Sarah knew that the real challenge lay in making the new culture stick. One particularly challenging day, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the results of a recent survey that had been sent out to the staff. The responses were mixed. While some praised the efforts and the vision, others felt that the initiative was disrupting the bank's core values. She had expected some resistance, but seeing it reflected so clearly in the survey results made the task ahead feel even more daunting. The success of the community initiative was undeniable, but Sarah now knew that she needed to address the deep-rooted skepticism before they could move forward. With a sigh, she placed the survey down and picked up her phone, dialing Walter's number. Walter answered on the first ring. "Sarah, how's everything going?" His voice was warm, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. He, too, had been feeling the pressure of the initiative. She exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts before responding. "It's going well, Walter. The outreach programs are thriving, and we're seeing real engagement from the community. But I'm worried. The results of the staff survey came in today, and there's more resistance than I anticipated. Some people just don't believe in this shift." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Walter spoke. "I figured there'd be some pushback. It's not easy to change a culture like this one. But Sarah, don't lose sight of what we're accomplishing. We're making a real impact out there. We just need to find a way to bring the rest of the staff along with us." "I know," Sarah replied, her tone steady but filled with concern. "But it's more than just a few dissenting voices. Some employees genuinely feel that we're veering too far from what Atlantic National was built on. It's a lot of change for people who've worked in this environment for decades. I'm worried that if we don't address this, we might lose the momentum we've built." Walter was silent for a moment, clearly processing her words. "I understand. The resistance is natural, but it's important that we show them this is a long-term shift, not just a passing trend. If we're truly going to be successful, the staff has to feel like they're part of this vision. It's not enough to have top-down leadership. We need to empower them to see the value in what we're doing." Sarah's mind began to shift from concern to action. "You're right. We need a more direct approach. Maybe we should hold a series of town hall meetings, open forums where we can have candid conversations with the staff, answer their questions, address their fears, and show them how they can be a part of this change. It's not just about policies, it's about getting them to buy into the heart of it." Walter's voice brightened with approval. "That's a good idea. If we can get the staff involved in the conversation and make them feel like stakeholders, they might start to see the bigger picture. Let's get something on the calendar, and I'll make sure everyone knows this is a priority. Thanks, Walter, Sarah said, feeling a sense of relief. I'll start working on the details. Let's get the ball rolling. We can't let the few voices of doubt undermine everything we've worked for. As Sarah ended the call, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The task ahead was still monumental, but now she had a plan in motion. The conversation with Walter had reminded her that the road to real change was never easy, but with every step they took, they were pushing forward, and that was what truly mattered. The town hall meetings were scheduled, and Sarah was determined to make them as effective as possible. The first few had been a success. Employees, particularly the ones who had been skeptical about the shift toward inclusivity, were beginning to open up. There were still questions, of course, but the conversations were becoming more about how they could contribute to the initiative rather than why it wouldn't work. Sarah had worked closely with Walter to ensure that every department felt involved. They wanted these meetings to be as much about listening as they were about educating. She had even added a few personal touches, bringing in people from the community who had benefited from the financial literacy programs to speak directly to the employees. Hearing firsthand accounts of how the bank's new direction was changing lives made the concept of inclusivity more tangible. It wasn't just an abstract idea, it was real, and it was making a difference. However, not all the feedback had been positive. Some employees still questioned the practicality of expanding the bank's focus beyond traditional high-net-worth individuals. One of the senior bankers, Mark, had expressed concern about the financial stability of the bank. He argued that focusing too much on lower-income clients could risk diluting the bank's brand. Sarah had anticipated some of this pushback, and while she respected his opinion, she knew that this was a crossroads moment for Atlantic National. They couldn't afford to continue ignoring the majority of the population. "I understand your concerns, Mark," Sarah had said during one of the meetings, her tone firm but respectful. "But we've seen time and time again that wealth inequality is a real issue. The financial systems we've relied on for decades have left too many people behind. The opportunity here isn't just in serving wealth, it's in creating a more inclusive system that serves everyone." Mark had been quiet for a moment before replying, "But can we really compete in that space? I'm not sure we can maintain the same level of service we provide to our current clients." Sarah smiled gently. "This isn't about replacing what we've done. It's about expanding the scope of what we offer. We can do both. We can continue serving our high net worth clients while also reaching those who have been excluded from the system for too long. In fact, I believe they'll complement each other." She could see the skepticism in his eyes, but there was also a flicker of something else, doubt mingled with curiosity. She knew it wasn't going to be easy to convince someone like Mark, but he wasn't the only one she needed to win over. Sarah had to keep the momentum going because she believed deeply that their model was the future of banking. The following town hall meetings continued, each one slowly helping to shift the mindset of employees. Sarah had made sure the meetings were interactive, ensuring everyone felt heard. In the next few sessions, there were less challenging questions, and more people began to share their own ideas for how the bank could better serve the underserved communities. For Sarah, it was a clear sign that the initiative was taking root, even in the most entrenched pockets of the institution. One of the pivotal moments came when Rebecca Palmer, the former manager who had publicly humiliated Sarah early on, stood up during a meeting. There was a collective pause in the room, the tension palpable. Rebecca had been noticeably quiet through the earlier discussions, her face unreadable. Sarah braced herself for what was to come. This was the moment Rebecca could either stand with them or continue to resist the changes. "I've been reflecting a lot on what this shift means, not just for the bank, but for the people we serve," Rebecca began, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I was wrong. I see now how deeply I've misunderstood what banking should be about. And I want to be a part of this change." A silence followed her admission, and Sarah felt a wave of surprise ripple through the room. Rebecca, the woman who had once made her feel like an outsider, was now publicly admitting her mistake. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Rebecca, but for the entire room. There was no turning back now. The cultural shift within the bank was happening. "I know I have a lot to learn," Rebecca continued, her gaze meeting Sarah's, but I want to help make this work. I want to work with all of you to build something that truly serves everyone, not just a select few. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions as she processed Rebecca's words. Part of her was surprised, and the other part of her, one that had always believed in the power of transformation, was deeply moved. The old Rebecca, the one who had dismissed her so easily, was gone. In her place stood someone willing to admit mistakes and work toward real change. "Thank you, Rebecca," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincerity. "It takes courage to admit when we've been wrong. And I believe together we can build a better future for this bank, one that's inclusive, respectful, and just." As the room erupted into applause, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just transpired. She knew this was a significant turning point, not just for Rebecca, but for the entire bank. It was proof that change was possible, that even the most ingrained mindsets could be transformed when given the right environment, the right leadership, and the right people willing to push for it. Later that day, as Sarah reflected on the success of the town halls, she realized just how far they had come. The road ahead was still long, and there would be challenges, no doubt, but for the first time, she felt a true sense of hope that this vision, this transformation, was becoming a reality. Atlantic National was no longer just a symbol of exclusivity. It was slowly becoming a symbol of inclusivity, and Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. She had started a movement, one that would extend far beyond the walls of the bank, touching communities and lives in ways she had once only dreamed of. And with people like Rebecca on her side now, she felt more confident than ever that they could change the way banking worked. For good. The days following Rebecca's public admission of her mistakes were filled with a sense of cautious optimism at Atlantic National. The shift in culture, although still fragile, had gained a significant ally in Rebecca, whose transformation had a ripple effect throughout the bank. People began to see that change wasn't just a matter of policies or presentations. It was about the people involved, their willingness to evolve, and the actions they took to make that shift real. Sarah had spent the last few days meeting with department heads, checking in on the progress of the community initiatives, and ensuring that all the programs they had rolled out were moving forward as planned. But despite the outward success, there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She knew that while the leadership team was now on board, there were still pockets of resistance within the bank, pockets that were not as easily swayed by enthusiasm and goodwill. The real challenge, Sarah realized, was making sure that the cultural shift would be sustained long-term. It couldn't simply be driven by her or by Walter. It needed to be embedded in the daily operations, the relationships with clients, and the very mindset of every employee. She understood that transformation wasn't linear. It had ebbs and flows, moments of progress and setbacks. The goal was to keep pushing forward no matter how long it took. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Thomas, one of the bank associates who had been deeply involved in the community outreach programs. She had come to rely on Thomas not only for his work ethic, but also for his genuine passion for the cause. "Sarah, we've got a problem." The message was brief, and her heart rate quickened as she typed back. "What happened?" Seconds later, the response came. "We've had some complaints from a few clients. They're concerned about the bank's new focus on inclusivity. They think it's diluting the high net worth services." A sense of unease washed over Sarah. It was exactly what she feared. The pushback from the wealthy clients who had been the bank's primary focus for decades. She had known it wouldn't be easy to balance both worlds, but hearing that the complaints were already surfacing made the challenge feel more immediate. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, staring out of her office window. There was no turning back now. This was exactly the kind of moment that would define whether their efforts were truly sustainable. Sarah took a deep breath and quickly dialed Walter's number. The weight of the situation felt heavier with each passing second, but she knew they needed to address the concerns before they spiraled further. The last thing they could afford was losing the support of their top clients, especially if those clients were questioning the direction of the bank. "Walter, we've got an issue," Sarah said as soon as he answered. "Thomas just sent me a message. Some of our high net worth clients are complaining. They think our focus on inclusivity is watering down our services. We can't let this grow into a bigger problem." There was a moment of silence before Walter responded, his tone thoughtful but measured. "I had a feeling this might come up. We've built this bank's reputation on serving the elite, and for many of our clients, that's what they expect. But this is part of the challenge, isn't it? We can't just please one group. We need to show that we can serve everyone and do it well. Sarah nodded, even though Walter couldn't see her. I get that, but if we lose their trust, we could undo everything we've worked for. We need to find a way to reassure them that the bank's commitment to inclusivity won't compromise the level of service they're used to. Walter's voice was calm but resolute. You're right. The key here is balance. We need to communicate that the initiative isn't about diminishing our services for the wealthy. It's about expanding our services for the broader community. Let's have a meeting with the senior staff tomorrow. We'll brainstorm strategies for addressing these concerns without sacrificing our core values. I'll make sure we have the right talking points ready for the clients. Sarah felt a little relief, but she knew the real work was in executing that strategy. I'll make sure Thomas is involved. He's been in the trenches with this community outreach. We need him to be part of the conversation with these clients. Good. We'll do this together, Walter said, his tone more confident now. This isn't just about responding to complaints. It's about reaffirming our values and showing that we can thrive in both spaces. I believe we can do that. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence for a few moments, thinking through the upcoming meeting. It was clear that the bank's transformation was far from complete. The battle for cultural change within Atlantic National was ongoing, and it would take every bit of perseverance and strategy to ensure the shift was successful. She had no illusions about how difficult it would be. There were always going to be challenges, moments where the path forward seemed uncertain. But as she looked back at all they had already accomplished, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of resolve. The future they were building was one worth fighting for, and Sarah knew that with the right approach, they could bridge the gap between old and new, ensuring that both their high-net-worth clients and their new community-focused clients felt equally valued. The conversation with Walter had solidified one thing. This wasn't just about winning a few battles. It was about changing the landscape of banking, and Sarah was determined to see that change through to the end. The day of the annual benefit gala had arrived, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves as she prepared for the evening. It was always a night of celebration for the Johnson Educational Foundation, a chance to showcase the progress they had made in helping underprivileged children and to raise funds for the next wave of educational initiatives. But this year felt different. This year, the foundation wasn't just the focal point, it was part of something much larger. Sarah stood at the entrance of the venue, greeting guests as they arrived. The grand ballroom of the hotel was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the quiet hum of conversations as people in their finest attire moved between clusters of tables. The familiar buzz of the event was comforting, but this year there was something else in the air. The inclusion of Atlantic National's community banking initiative was being highlighted, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of that responsibility. For months, she had worked closely with Walter and the senior team to ensure that the bank's partnership with the foundation wasn't just a superficial gesture. The idea had been to demonstrate that financial institutions could play a crucial role in fostering education and lifting communities up, not just for the wealthy, but for everyone. It was an effort that required a delicate balance, ensuring the needs of both high-net-worth clients and the new communities they were serving were met without compromise. Tonight, she was more aware than ever of the bridge she was trying to build. There were whispers among the guests, some questioning how a bank that had built its name on exclusivity could genuinely serve underserved communities without diluting its brand. The delicate dance of bridging these two worlds weighed heavily on her mind. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed Rebecca Palmer, who had been making strides in her role since her public change of heart, talking to some of the bank's senior clients. Rebecca had become a key figure in this transformation, her own journey mirroring the bank's shift. Sarah had always believed in second chances, and seeing Rebecca now, helping bridge gaps between the new and old clients, was a testament to the work they had done. But even with the positive strides, Sarah knew that it wasn't enough to be content with small victories. There was still much work to do. She caught Daniel's eye across the room and felt a brief moment of peace. He was engaged in conversation with one of the new partners from the outreach programs. His face lit up with a genuine passion that reminded her why they were doing all of this. Together, they had turned an idea into something real, something that was making a difference. But as Sarah continued to make her way through the crowd, she realized that the true test of their efforts would come after tonight. The work was only just beginning, and the challenges they faced were far from over. The evening unfolded with all the elegance and grandeur of previous galas, but the underlying sense of anticipation was impossible to ignore. Sarah moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and catching up with longtime supporters of the foundation. Her mind, however, remained focused on the bigger picture, the next steps. The gala was important, yes, but the true measure of success would be in how they would leverage the momentum from tonight's event. The connections made, the partnerships forged, and the conversations had were all crucial to building something long-lasting. As the speeches began, Sarah found herself standing near the stage, her heart racing in anticipation. Walter Thompson, alongside some of the foundation's board members, would take the stage to announce a new round of funding for the Community Banking Initiative. The announcement was meant to solidify the bank's commitment, not just through words but through concrete action. Sarah glanced over at Daniel, who stood beside her, offering a silent reassurance. His unwavering support had been one of the few constants in the whirlwind of change they had been navigating. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Walter's voice rang out through the microphone as he began his speech. "This evening is about more than just celebration. It's about recognizing the powerful shift taking place, both in the banking industry and in the communities we serve. Atlantic National's new Community Banking Initiative is not just about offering services, it's about creating opportunities. Tonight, we are proud to announce that we are increasing our funding to local educational programs, scholarships, and small business development initiatives, all aimed at ensuring that those who have been historically underserved have a fair shot at success." The room fell silent for a brief moment, the weight of Walter's words settling over the guests. Sarah could see that even those who had been skeptical were starting to shift in their seats, a sense of admiration in their eyes. But the true test, Sarah knew, would come in the months to follow. Tonight was just the beginning. Now they needed to deliver on these promises. As the applause filled the room, Sarah felt a sense of pride and determination flood through her. She knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but in that moment, standing in the same room as the people who had supported her vision, she felt more confident than ever that they could accomplish what they had set out to do. She turned to Daniel, who had been watching the crowd with a look of quiet pride. "This is just the start," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "Exactly," Daniel replied, his gaze meeting hers with a shared understanding. "The real work begins now." Together they stood, not just as partners in life, but in this shared mission. And as the evening carried on with laughter, dancing, and celebration, Sarah knew that they were on the brink of something profound. The initiative was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming a reality. And with each step they took, they were building a future that could change everything. The morning light filtered through the large windows of the conference room, casting a warm glow over the crowd gathered for the final meeting of the year. Sarah stood at the front, her gaze sweeping across the room filled with colleagues, leaders, and key partners. The last year had been a whirlwind of change, challenges, and triumphs, but today, as the year came to a close, it was time for reflection. And for Sarah, it was time to assess how far they had truly come. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of what she was about to say. "This year has been nothing short of transformative. We've faced obstacles, certainly, but we've overcome them by staying true to our mission, by remembering why we started this journey in the first place." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in. She could feel the presence of Daniel standing quietly by her side, his steady gaze reassuring her. They had been through so much together, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team. Atlantic National Bank, as you all know, was once synonymous with exclusivity. For years, it was a place for the wealthy, the powerful, and those who could afford to be part of its world. But over the last year, we've redefined that image. We've made it a place that serves everyone, from the highest net worth clients to those who have been traditionally excluded from the financial system. We've made inclusivity a core part of our mission, and I am proud of what we've achieved. The room was silent, and for a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to take in the faces around her. She saw the tiredness in some eyes, the result of a year full of hard work. But she also saw something else: hope. There was a growing belief in what they were doing, a belief that hadn't been there when they started. The change was taking root. As we close out this year, I want to talk about where we go from here, Sarah continued. This is not the end of our journey. It's just the beginning. We have made incredible strides, but there is still so much to be done. Our commitment to bridging gaps, opening doors, and making financial resources accessible to all will continue to drive us forward. She could feel the energy shift in the room. There was a sense of anticipation, a readiness for the future. Sarah knew they were on the right path, but she also understood that their journey was far from over. Sarah took a deep breath, looking around the room once more before continuing. We are going to push forward with new initiatives. Initiatives that will expand our reach even further into the communities we've started to serve. We're going to increase our partnerships with local schools, strengthen our financial literacy programs, and continue providing the necessary resources to help families and individuals build better futures. We're not just offering services, we're offering a pathway to empowerment. She could feel the energy in the room building with each word. She was proud of the work they had done, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Changing the financial landscape wasn't something that could happen in a year or even two. It was a long-term commitment that would take perseverance and constant effort. But as Sarah looked around at the people who had supported her every step of the way, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. They were all in this together. We're also going to double down on our employee development programs, she said, shifting her tone to a more personal note. The success of this transformation depends not only on what we offer to our clients, but how we invest in our people. You are the ones who make this change possible. We need every one of you to continue championing this vision, to continue showing up with dedication, empathy, and innovation. This isn't a shift that happens overnight, but together, we're making it happen. Sarah paused for a moment, glancing at Daniel. He gave her a subtle nod, his presence always a quiet but powerful reminder of their shared commitment to this journey. She was more determined than ever to see this vision through. As we move forward, we need to be mindful of the lessons we've learned, Sarah continued, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their background or financial situation. That real wealth isn't just measured in dollars and cents, but in the impact we have on the lives of those we serve. And that change doesn't come from one person or one department. It comes from all of us working together. A quiet murmur of agreement filled the room, and Sarah could see the spark in her colleagues' eyes. The future was not just something to be hoped for. It was something to be created, and they were going to create it together. Thank you, she said, her voice full of resolve. Let's make this next year even better than the last. The journey continues. As the applause erupted, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid, and the commitment to continue pushing forward was stronger than ever. With every challenge they faced, Sarah knew that together they would continue to build something that would stand the test of time.